Our scripture this morning is Mark 12:28 through 34. Now, one of the biblical scholars heard the other scholars, chief priests, and elders discussing amongst themselves, and seeing that Jesus answered them well, the scholar asked Jesus, "Which commandment is the first of all?" Jesus answered, "The first is this: Hear, O Israel, the Holy One our God, the Holy is one. You shall love the Holy One your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind, and with all your strength. The second is this: you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." Then the biblical scholar said to him, "You are right, teacher. You have truly said that God is one, and besides God there is no other, and to love God with all the heart, and with all the understanding, and with all the strength, and to love one another as neighbor as oneself. This is much more important than all who burnt offerings and sacrifices." And when Jesus saw that the scholar answered wisely, he said, "You are not far from the reign of God." After that, no one dared ask Jesus any questions.
You'll notice a little bit of a theme here, because I'm also going to tell you a little bit of a story of hiking. Most of you will have been seeing pictures or hearing stories already from my recent trip, but in case you're new, first of all, my name is Reverend Kelly Colwell, and I am one of the ministers here. So if we haven't met yet, please come and introduce yourself to me after the service. And I just came back from vacation. A couple of weeks ago, my partner and I spent 2.5 weeks in Peru. We were so excited to be able to finally get on an international trip after the long pause in such things that the pandemic offered us. And one of the things that we planned is a 5-day trek. A 5-day trek called the Sal Kantai Trek, which sort of goes around. It's some parts of it on an old Inca trail and some parts of it through some really beautiful valleys on the way to the town at the base of the mountain where Machu Picchu is. And when we planned it, I will admit to having some nerves. It looked hard and high, although beautiful, and I wasn't quite sure whether I was physically up to it. And we trained pretty hard in the spring, and then we got COVID in June, and it felt like it kind of erased a lot of my training. So, I figured it'll be fine, people will help, it'll be okay. And I told myself, you have to take it as it comes. You have to be okay with the possibility that you're not quite up to this. I told myself that a bunch of times because I'm not very good at that. And I have some baggage around being strong enough for things and ready enough for things and physically able enough for things. I think it's because I hike a lot and I don't look like a lot of other hikers. I see a lot of people on the trail that are thinner than me. A lot of people on the trail that look fit and slender and who fit into regular size hiking clothes. And seeing that all the time and feeling the gaze of those people on me on the trails, I think has left me with a little bit of an attitude. Just a little sense of like, I'll show you. I can do anything. It's no problem. And a little bit of pressure that I put on myself to prove it, to prove that people who look like me can hike just as well as anyone else. So on the 4th day that we were in Peru, we got picked up from our hotel at, I think, about 4 a.m. to begin the drive And we got to, after 3 hours of beautiful driving, we got to the place where we would have our first day hike. It was also the location of our first campsite on that trek. The day hike, the campsite's at about 13,500 feet. It's pretty high. I think it's the highest I've ever slept, actually. It was pretty high. It was absolutely spectacular, absolutely gorgeous, and the day hike was pretty hard. I did it. I got up to the lake. It was no problem. We were able to take our time. I just stopped a lot to catch my breath, but it was fine. And I asked our guide, Diego, now that you've seen me do this hike, am I going to be able to do the hike tomorrow? And he said, sure, no problem. I think you can do it. Now, as it turns out, we were having a slight amount of cultural difference. And what he meant was, it's no problem because we have a horse. And what I meant was, can I walk on my feet up to the pass? And I think what he heard when he heard me ask this question was not, am I physically capable because I really want to do this, but is there something that could make this easier for me? So we had quite a cold night. I didn't sleep all that much. We got up very early the next morning to start our trek. Day 2 of the trek was the hardest one. We needed to gain almost 3,000 feet of elevation. And then we were going to walk and lose more than 5,000 feet of elevation. It's 15 and a half miles that day, which is within my scope of hiking normally at like sea level or close to sea level. And I figured because I'd done, my range is like 13-ish on a backpacking trip, but I didn't have to carry my stuff. So I thought this is going to be fine. As it turns out, spoiler alert, I probably had COVID. This was probably day 1. I never tested positive, but Cheryl got the cough and runny nose that I got, and hers was COVID. So there may have been reasons, in addition to the altitude and the steepness of the hike and the cold and my poor sleep, that I was dragging a little bit that day. However, we started off, we hiked and hiked and hiked. We were probably about 2/3 of the way up. And our guide said, I think it's a good time for you to get on that horse. I understood him to say, I don't think you can do this. I'm pretty sure in retrospect that what he was actually saying was, we have this horse. Why don't you have a ride on it? Here's a bit of luxury for you. This whole thing is, in fact, for fun. Like, you're on this trip for pleasure. You've paid a bunch of money to be on this trip for fun, and we have this horse who is just along in case anybody needs it. Why not? But like I said about the baggage, I understood him to be saying, we don't have time to wait for you anymore, and you need to get your butt on this horse so that we can get this show on the road. So they loaded me onto what I felt to be a very small horse. Pictures forthcoming. But what I felt was quite a small horse for such a large person. And I really had to work pretty hard, and my knees were like up in my face, and I was just clinging on for dear life. I didn't take any pictures of that particular, about 1.5 miles that I rode the horse up to the pass. And all along, I'm saying to the horse, I'm so sorry. You're doing such a great job, and I'm so sorry. Now, afterwards, my guide told me the horse probably only spoke Quechua, so I was doing my best in Spanish, but the horse probably wasn't understanding that anyway. Apologizing and apologizing, And I got up to the top of the pass, and then I had to wait for about 40 minutes because Cheryl and Diego were still on foot. If you could imagine a recipe for not feeling a whole lot of love for myself, for me, it would be that particular combination. I'm sitting at the top of this pass watching literally 100 hikers, probably. This is a busy trail with a lot of people. Walk up that hill. I'm watching person after person, fit and slender, marching up that hill and getting to the top and raising their trekking poles in triumph. I did it. Person after person, as I just stewed in my disappointment and my feeling of like, I failed. I did not prepare enough. I didn't take enough care of my own body somehow. I should have done something different. Not the best, despite the incredible views, the incredible setting, the incredible fact that I walked up 2/3 of it at least and rode a horse up the rest, which I also am not very good at, which as it turned out required quite a bit of effort. Kind of different effort than the walking, but it wasn't nothing. And that I still had 10 miles and 5,000 feet of elevation lost to go. It's not as if I didn't have a good hike that day. But I was just letting that experience just wreck it. Just steal all of the grandeur out of it. I thought about that moment when I was thinking about the scripture for today, because I was thinking about how easy it is for me to love the people around me, and how hard it is sometimes to turn that love towards myself. What does it mean to love your neighbor as much as you love yourself, if the amount of love that you have for yourself is not all that significant? What does it mean to allow the moments where you are least impressed with yourself to define the whole picture? And what does it mean for our ability to do the rest of the instructions that Jesus gave us, to love God with all of our heart and soul and mind and strength? In that moment, the task of loving God for me was the task of taking in where I was, taking in the beauty of that place. And I was too busy stewing in my frustration about not having been able to walk up the whole way to even take it in. Luckily, God has a lot of patience for me. Luckily, God gives me a lot of extra chances, a lot of repeats, and a lot of interventions. And I don't necessarily want to say or claim that this was entirely for me, but Cheryl and Diego got up there. And we started taking some pictures, and I started working on making a happy shape with my face so that the pictures would look like, here we are at the peak. I was like, it goes like this, and also this side, and at the same time. I sort of remembered, but not that well. And then there was an avalanche. Not right where we were. We weren't in any danger, but it was really loud and kind of dramatic. And a big cloud of snow puffed up and moved down the valley. And I watched that for a minute, just transported, just taken out of myself. Thank God. Because I was not really enjoying being in myself before that. Getting a break was really helpful. And as I watched that avalanche go down the valley, I turned and I noticed a group of people on their way up the hill on horseback. As it turns out, you could rent horses at the bottom. You could do the whole thing on horseback, all the way up to the peak. And I watched this group of people make their way up the final hill with huge smiles, just in awe of the landscape, in awe of everything. And they got up to the top and they hopped off their horses. I hope I didn't seem like too much of a creeper, because I was really watching them. They hopped off their horses, and their guide told them, offer your horse your thanks. And so they did that. They each offered some thanks, and they learned how to say thanks in Quechua, and they gave their horses a pat. And they were so triumphant. They felt so good about getting up to the top of that pass on horseback. They had no problem with it. This whole group of people, they were wearing hiking clothes. They were all set for the rest of the trek. They were doing fine. Their trek was not wrecked by those horses. In fact, the horses were a luxury item. They were something they enjoyed. They weren't feeling bad about themselves at all for taking that part of the trek. Or at least if they were making happy shapes with their faces, so you couldn't tell at all. They got up to the top and they raised their trekking poles and they took all their pictures. And I thought to myself, is this all unnecessary? Am I stewing for nothing right now? Could I maybe recognize the fact that I have gotten myself to Peru? I have booked a trek. I have hiked and ridden a horse up to this incredible location. God is giving me this day. Could I maybe just love that? Instead of being so busy thinking about what I had in mind for myself, that I couldn't see what had actually arrived for me. We hiked down. It took most of the rest of the day. It was really far. My legs were wrecked by the end of it. That downhill was killer. And we saw so many plants and so many birds. We hiked through all these different sort of altitudinal ecosystems, down from the high sort of alpine area with no trees down into the high jungle. We saw orchids and bromeliads. We saw farms with coffee and bananas and avocado. And it was incredible. And every time I started thinking about that horse ride, I reminded myself of the other group. And I asked God, please help me let go of that. And it was slow. It didn't happen right away. But I think that if we're going to live our whole lives in our actual bodies, if we're going to love God and God's world with our whole selves, then we can't afford to be spending part of our energy stewing about the parts of ourselves that we find harder to love. We can't afford to have part of our energy sucked into self-doubt and negative self-talk, we can't afford to let that distract us. Eyes on the prize. And the prize is what's all around us. The prize is what God is giving to us. We need our whole selves for that. So we got to let it go. A couple days later, after a bunch more walking, we landed at another campsite and we took a taxi over from there to a hot springs nearby, one of the sort of extra add-ons on the trek. And this trek is full of tourists from everywhere, and we're sitting in the hot springs, and next to us, we introduce ourselves to a couple from LA. It's how international travel goes sometimes. And they had just done the Sal Kantai Trek as well. They'd been up and over that same pass. And we said, "Oh, how did it go for you?" And they look like they hike all the time. They look just fit as anything. And they said, we did that first day up to the lake, the day hike, and we came back down. And our guide said, "Well, how was that? And how are you feeling about the day tomorrow?" And we said, "Forget it. We're getting the horses." I definitely did not feel like dragging my butt up another big hill. So we just went for it. And the horses were great. And then we had all this energy for the walk down. It felt like God showing off a little bit. Reinforcing to me, "Buddy, this is your own baggage. You are inventing trouble for your own self. You are getting in your own way. You are blocking your own pleasure, and you need to knock it off." This is my prayer for all of us, that we can find ways to get out of our own way and to let God offer us those gifts and to receive them with our whole heart, with our whole mind, with our whole soul, with our whole strength, with our whole lives. Thanks be to God.